The hollow, metallic clink of a shovel striking sun-baked earth at 7:12 a.m. is a specific kind of biological violence, one I have recorded in my field logs hundreds of times. You dug your hands into that bed last spring, expecting the dark, crumbly reward of your labor. But instead, you pulled up a fistful of something that looked more like an abandoned parking lot than a living garden. It was gray, fractured, and bone-dry. In my observations of suburban growers, the pattern is hauntingly consistent. You had already thrown $75 worth of bagged compost at the problem. You followed the watering schedule to the minute. You adhered to every desperate promise printed on every bottle at the garden center. Yet, by midsummer, your tomatoes still came up yellow, stunted, and curling at the edges, as if the leaves themselves were trying to crawl away from the very ground they were anchored in. The psychological toll of this failure is what I find most striking. You likely blamed your own hands, perhaps you overwatered, or perhaps you planted 10 days too early. But what the staff at the hardware store will never disclose, primarily because it would render their entire fertilizer aisle obsolete, is that your soil isn't hungry, it is dead. In my research into subterranean ecology, I've realized there is a massive structural difference between the two. You can pour all the synthetic nitrogen and phosphorus you want onto a biological corpse, and nothing will wake up. What is missing beneath your feet is not a chemical additive, it is a civilization. When the earthworm populations vanish, the collapse is silent but total. I've mapped the physics of this transition. The ground seals shut, forming a hydrophobic crust. Rainwater simply sheets off the surface instead of soaking in. The roots of your crops hit a physical wall exactly 2.5 inches down and simply quit. At that point, every plant in your bed is essentially a patient on life support, completely dependent on the nutrient drip feed you provide from a plastic jug. You aren't gardening at that stage, you are managing a botanical ward. The cruelest irony is that almost every habit the modern gardener practices is exactly what drives the worms out. Every time you engage a rototiller, you are shredding the sophisticated tunnel networks they spent months engineering. Every time you leave the soil bare through the high heat of July, the surface bakes to a temperature that no biological entity can survive. Every dose of synthetic salt fertilizer you scatter acts as an osmotic scorch on the microbial layer that worms actually require for survival. In my analysis of the miracle soil industry, I've found that every spring, millions of people rip open $52 sacks of so-called premium garden mix, dump them on top of ground that has already given up, and wonder why their produce looks anemic by the following month. That bag is not medicine, it is a clinical bandage slapped over a wound the industry itself engineered decades ago. We were convinced that dirt needs to be force-fed synthetic nitrogen to perform. But my data shows that every granule of chemical fertilizer acts like a fuse moving through dynamite. It burns through the mycorrhizal network, the ancient fungal threads that serve as the actual circulatory system of the earth. These threads shuttle water, share phosphorus between plant roots, and broadcast immune signals when pathogens arrive. One season of heavy ammonium nitrate, and that network goes silent. The system then enters a state of dependency, and the sales pitch returns. Your soil is weak, buy more product. It is a subscription model designed by corporations and dressed up as agriculture. I view tilling as the second half of this long-term con. Every time a rototiller chews through your garden bed, it isn't preparing the ground. It is performing open-heart surgery on living earth with a blender. It shreds the worm tunnels, collapses the air pockets that roots depend on for gas exchange, and exposes buried organic matter to the sun, where it oxidizes and vanishes as carbon dioxide. Instead of feeding the microbes, the soil doesn't come back stronger, it comes back addicted, incapable of holding moisture or supporting biology without another hit from a garden center shelf. However, I have tracked a different biological trajectory. Imagine a handful of wet cardboard, plain, ugly, and cost-free, buried exactly 7 inches down in a shallow trench. In my lab, I've watched as microbes colonize these damp fibers within hours. Within 9 days, the worms follow the microbial signal and move in, feeding, tunneling, and reproducing exactly where your plant roots need them most. That soggy cardboard is a perfect mimicry of what a forest floor does with fallen bark, a system nature perfected millions of years before anyone thought to shrink-wrap compost. Within hours of burying that soaked cardboard, something wakes up. Not the worms at first, but the scouts, the bacteria and fungi. They colonize that wet organic surface like pioneers. As they eat and multiply, they release specific chemical trails into the surrounding soil. A biological dinner bell ringing through the darkness of the earth. Worms pick up this signal from a distance that would surprise you, and they come. But here is the law of the underground economy that I had to learn through observation. The worms are not eating the cardboard. They are grazing on the microbes that are feeding on the cardboard. Beneath your feet is a food web running on a chain of consumption. So precise, it makes modern industrial supply lines look clumsy. Bacteria break down the carbon, fungi thread through the pores to transport nutrients, and worms graze on both. What emerges from the other end, the worm castings, is a substance so nutrient-dense that no factory has ever replicated its complexity. As each worm lays cocoons in that damp trench, several offspring hatch when the moisture levels hold. Within a few weeks, tunnels radiate outward from that single burial spot. The ground visibly darkens and becomes loose. Plant roots follow those tunnels like high-speed highways, reaching moisture and minerals they could never access in compacted dirt. This is the shift from tourism to architecture. Surface feeding is just tourism. The worms show up, grab a quick meal, and leave. But when you bury the food source 7 inches deep, you are building a permanent habitat. You are providing shelter, moisture, and a steady food supply wrapped into one subterranean pocket. This is not mere attraction, it is infrastructure. In my research, I've found that the real lever for soil health is embarrassingly simple, and it costs you $0. You take a handful of wet cardboard, your kitchen scraps, and perhaps a few handfuls of dead leaves. You dig a shallow trench, no deeper than the length of your hand, drop it all in, and cover it back up. Then, you walk away. I mean, literally walk away. No tilling, no turning, no expensive compost tumbler spinning in your yard like a desperate soil lottery machine. You have just buried a meal ticket and allowed biology to take the night shift. That buried pocket of organic matter breaks down slowly over months. The worms sense the moisture and the decomposition, and they migrate in entire colonies toward that single buried zone. In one afternoon of lazy labor, you have constructed an underground highway system that feeds itself. The next step is the roof over the factory floor. I've observed that the most resilient beds are those where the surface is layered with several inches of leaves or straw, the materials usually sitting in your yard for free. That mulch serves as a thermal buffer, holding moisture in and keeping the temperature stable. It gives the worms a reason to travel upward at night to feed, before retreating to the safety of the trench when the sun hits. Without that cover, bare soil bakes and cracks, pushing every living thing out. With it, you create a biological loop. Worms eat, worms tunnel, worms breed, soil loosens, and water holds. You do almost nothing, and the system accelerates. If you repeat this burial in a different spot every month, by the end of one growing season, your entire garden bed is threaded with living tunnels and rich castings. Store-bought fertilizer becomes an unnecessary expense. The less you disturb this network, the faster it grows. Every time you reach for a mechanical tiller, you are crushing the cocoons, where the next generation is waiting to hatch. In my field journals, I've noted that your laziness is the system's greatest biological ally. There are, however, specific failure points to monitor. If you bury the material too deep, you suffocate the aerobic microbes that the worms depend on. If you toss in oily or salty kitchen scraps, you have built a biological repellent instead of a restaurant. If you let the soil dry out completely, the reproduction cycle stops cold. The margin for error is small, but the actions required are even smaller, shallow, moist, covered, and undisturbed. I want you to consider a moment that most people dread, but few prepare for. A morning where the grocery store shelves are stripped bare overnight, where prices triple before breakfast. You see your neighbor driving to 3 different stores, searching for tomatoes that were picked green 2,400 miles away and shipped in a truck that might not arrive next week. That person is experiencing the fear of a system they don't control. Meanwhile, you walk 13 steps out your back door, push aside a few layers of leaf mulch, and pull dinner straight from the ground, a ground that is crawling with the life you built yourself for free. You aren't just growing vegetables, you are building sovereignty.